So it's my pleasure to introduce our MC for the evening, Randon Billings Noble, who is an essayist. Her collection, Be With Me Always, was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2019. And her anthology of lyric essays, which we are here for this evening, A Harp in the Stars, was published by Nebraska in this year. Currently, she is the founding editor of the online lit mag After the Art and teaches in West Virginia Wesleyan's Low-Residency MFA program and Goucher's MFA in Nonfiction Program. And you can read more at her website to learn everything that she's been publishing and everything that she writes and everything that she does. So Randon, I just want to welcome you to the virtual stage and hand off to you, and good show to everyone who's joined us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach, and thank you to the Writer Center for hosting this reading for A Harp in the Stars, which is an anthology of lyric essays. We have 3 contributors here tonight who I will introduce in just a minute. Then we'll get to hear a pretty wide variety of lyric essays. And after we've all read, we welcome questions from the audience about lyric essays, about putting together an anthology, about any of the specific essays we wrote, about the writing life in general, anything in that arena. We'll be happy to talk with you more about. So I'm going to begin by reading a little bit from the introduction. I start the introduction thinking about the origin of the word lyric coming from the lyre, which in Greek mythology was invented by Hermes, kind of passed on almost as a bribe to Apollo. And Orpheus is the most sort of famous player of the lyre, a very powerful musician and poet whose music got him past the sirens to get the golden fleece, got him into the underworld to almost rescue his dead wife. And I claim that lyric essays have the same kind of power to soothe, to harrow, to persuade, to move, to raise, to rouse, and to overcome. So now I'm going to read a bit from the introduction. Like Orpheus and his songs, lyric essays try something daring. They rely more on intuition than exposition. They often use image more than narration, and they question more than answer. But despite all this looseness, the lyric essay still has the responsibilities of any essay: to try to figure something out, to play with ideas, to show a shift in thinking, however subtle. The whole of the lyric essay adds up to more than the sum of its parts. Lyric essays require a kind of passion, a commitment to weirdness in the face of convention, a willingness to risk confusion, a comfort with outsider status. When I'm writing a lyric essay, I'm not worried about what it is or what to call it. But when I started teaching lyric essays, I needed to put words to the form, to try to define it, to make it at least a little more accessible and understandable, even as I kept running into contradictions in my own thinking. Sometimes I enjoyed the lyric essay's elusiveness. Other times I felt like I was the one following backwards hoofprints. But the lyric essay's wildly capaciousness is among its strengths. I came to define a lyric essay as a piece of writing with a visible, standout, or unusual structure that explores, forecasts, or gestures to an idea in an unexpected way. But about that visible, standout, unusual structure, those gestured to ideas, lyric essays are tricky. If you try to mount one to a spreading board, it's likely to dodge the pin and fly away. If you try to press one between 2 slides, it might find a way to ooze down your sleeve. And if you try to set it within a taxonomy, it will pose the same problems as the platypus, a mammal, but one that lays eggs, semi-aquatic, living in both water and on land, and venomous, a trait that belongs mostly to reptiles and insects. It will run away if on land, its gait that of a furry alligator, or swim off in the undulating way of beavers. Either way, it can threaten you with a poison spur before it ripples off. In this anthology, as well as in this reading, you'll find a wide range of thinking about the lyric essay, how it can leap, search, wander, hint at, unravel, excavate, and create, how it can both replicate and explain trauma, how it comes from or leaves behind fiction and poetry, how it acts like a panther, an iceberg, an on-ramp, an artichoke, how it's defined and now it can never be defined, how it tries and how it delivers, how it sings and how it plays. Orpheus's lyre accompanied him through all sorts of adventures. It traveled with him as deep as the underworld, and after his death was sent by Zeus to live among the stars. You can see its constellation, Lyra, in the summer months if you live in the northern hemisphere, the winter months if you live in the southern. This feels like an apt metaphor for the lyric essay. The stars are there, but their shape is what your mind brings to them. So that's just a bit from the introduction. And now we're going to hear some lyric essays in action. So our first reader is Kristen Kaufman, who is the author of the lyric essay chapbook Notes to a Mother God, which was a winner of the Paper Nautilus debut chapbook series. And I can attest it's a wonderful chapbook. Her work can be found or is forthcoming in A Harp in the Stars, Nimrod International Journal, Tupelo Quarterly, the Cincinnati Review, Willow Springs, Diagram, Booth, Smoke Lawn Quarterly, Hobart, and the Normal School, among others. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you. And I just want to thank the Writer Center again for having us, and to Randon for putting this amazing anthology together. Thank you so much. My essay is titled Thanatophobia, which is characterized as the fear of one's own death. So happy thoughts. The first thing I learn about death is the way a dustpan can sever the head of a snake. The way my mother wields the sharp edge, brings it down just behind the jaws. I watch as the mouth opens and closes, pulses in a sunspot disc in the grass. I ask if it knows what comes next, if the memory of mice and fat frogs still spark a connection between cells. The separation of the body is an inconsequential state, and I want to take the head into my room. I want to touch the tip of its nose and see if it knows what I am. I'm told there are angels in the rafters of our house, in the corners of my room, and lurking in the hall. Picture God as a hero of war. Picture light and dark on the battlefield of a girl's hip bone. You know what side you're on, so why be afraid? When they tell me to look for angels, I ask if it's all the same, if the branches and the roots are all just the tree growing out of my parietal lobe. I search biblical texts for how scientists differentiate wrens from bees. I look for similarities in wings and measure the width of 6 spindled legs. I wonder if their God could tell them apart. Physicists claim energy is transformed when a heart stops. Consider how the universe was formed with a finite set of hands. No more could be created with the birth of every star. Our hydrogen atoms, a memory of where it all began. I sleep on my grandmother's roof to feel the beginning of trees, the rise of a sapling where nothing else will grow. I whisper into its leaves for days, into weeks, draw a circle in salt to protect the shallow-fingered core. I still can't prevent the disfigurement of leaves or the retraction of roots into a thin and falling stem. Church conjures way to control the way it ends, count the ways I can step into light. The world is lost in the belly of a whale. See how we sit there all in a row, chins tucked down for a dead and living sun. They say that God is a thunderclap, lightning touch on the back of my neck. God is a chef with his hands in our bowls. Make me something new, make me malleable, replace my thoughts with the creation of sun. Draw me into straight lines that aren't afraid of the dark. A box can become the shape of a tomb. Hatchlings sleep in a mound of down and exposed skin, wings tucked against their ribs in a makeshift nest. Every morning I slip worms into their open beaks, only to watch the thick bodies inch back up toward escape, the baby birds incapable of holding the live food down. Their beaks close in hunger, feeble attempts, the worms' bodies dangling from one side. I instinctively know how their breathing will begin to slow, how I'll cradle their limp heads, marbles in my palm, How I'll hold my breath until my heart pounds in my ears, how I'll find pin feathers under my bed for months after they're gone. When my father says my aunt has passed, my room is uncomfortable black. The heart is a weak and mistaken machine. Her heart, a drawing with disconnected lines. I want to ask where the dead birds go and how long it takes for a body to become a shell. How once I pressed my shoe to a cricket's head and listened for the hollow snap. But my father is not a house with open doors. And for months, I wake up screaming in the dark. Night terrors are normal, they say. Tuck her back into bed. When she dreams, she sees her face. Tell her the earth is a broken wheel and we are all made for sky. At 16, I hear voices whisper my name. Once, a shadow outside my door. A psychic says I can hear the other side, how nothing is ever gone if we search hard enough. Listen, every knock is a vibration through the oldest pine. You can whisper at one end of a lake and the sound will glide above the surface, spread its fingers at unimaginable speeds into the expanse, the energy dispersing until words meld into multi-layered moans. Put your ear to the water, the muffled memory of a baby's birth, and egret's last words in the dark. Because I'm unsure of what happens next, I cling to the things I can control. I say prayers in the shape of my grandmother's mouth. I pull wishbones from the cavities of birds. I ask my mother if I can be baptized again, to let me submerge in an unhindered cleanse. I make confessions of shadows and the way I catch my breath, but she says the church won't allow this again, that God is a flood who only swells once. How I have been filled, and isn't that enough? But I tell her how a possum was dead in the field. She asks if the legs were curled in a run, if its teeth were still exposed in a smile. We find a garter snake on the road, its tail bloodied and curved to one side. My sister and I retrieve a small box that we fill with dried grass, leaves, and dandelion bones. I pick up the thin body, trace its stripes with the tip of my thumb, nestle it into the soft bed. We leave the box on the back porch, and in the morning, the snake is gone. I feel abandoned by its will to move, this lesson in how nothing wants to die. I imagine it has turned into other things, metamorphosed into a great blue heron or the hoof of a deer. I remember how energy is an invisible cloud rolling from one life to the next, the snake, then the tree, then my mother's soft blonde hair. The doctor's office is a white box. I answer my questions about the phases of the moon, how the earth spins in the spiraled arms of its galaxy, far from the center like a wayward child. I tell him how I opened myself for a man, watched a chicken devour her own legs, and how sometimes I know I'm the product of a billion dying stars, that I feel these molecules decaying faster than the speed of sound, faster than how a train can dismantle the head of a bear. I tell him my fear of the dark, my fear of losing connection to the trees, the absence of all this light. I know what it means to be unheard. I hold my dog on the day she dies, her long, slender nose in the crook of my arm. The weight of her feels like a question of time, how once we were new in an unfenced yard. I keep her for hours at the base of an elm, remember her paw in the palm of my hand. I know she's gone, but I still feel her breath, still feel her hum down the length of my spine. I dig her a grave the way a god might create, give her a home in the movement of clay. I stay with her in the dark, the first full night, and hear the pond carry voices from the porch. If energy is never created or destroyed, then the whales could have once been hatchlings in the grass, the tallest felled oak. I dream of the way a voice can sound close. It erupts and then spreads like the first prevailing wind, one point to the next without knowing why. If there are two sides to this, then the bridge must be sea. I wake up each night screaming questions into black. Someone tell me where the failed saplings go, where these thoughts are kept in an optimistic sky, how my moans will drift when even moons can disappear. A child begins to bloom, and I'm consumed by her round head, the perfect placement of the sun, each finger encapsulating an infinite system of stars. Our roots connecting in a disordered tangle of touch and sound. My nights are filled with new ways to fear, how the heart is an imperfect vessel for love, something that can stop should never mark time. But sometimes I can feel how a moment is enough. The tree is the bud and the bird and the grass. When I remember that death is an uncracked shell, that fear is the thief of a million cocoons, how this girl is the water I whisper across, if they hear me so soft on the other side.
Thank you so much, Kristen. If we were all in a room together, I feel like, you know, we would have this sort of beat to take this in with people clapping and such. But I think it's nice to just take a little breath between these readings. So thank you. Our next reader is Sandra Beasley, who's the author of Made to Explode, Count the Waves, I Was the Jukebox, winner of the Barnard Women Poets Prize, Theories of Falling, winner of the New Issues Poetry Prize, and Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, Tales from an Allergic Life, which is a disability memoir. She also edited Vinegar and Char, verse from the Southern Foodways Alliance, and she lives in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Sandra.
Sure, and thank you for that terrific reading that we just had. I'm really excited to join you today. My neighbor who's in on this will appreciate that we've had helicopters circling around our building for the last 20 minutes, which is a very Southwest Washington, D.C. thing. That's where I'm located. So I'm going to hope they don't come on too strong in my time with you. Just a quick overview. I'm actually just going to talk briefly about a larger project that my piece is from. If you've already gotten a sneak preview via the book, you know it's short. So that'll let me kind of introduce it, read it, and then actually Randon had a terrific suggestion of finishing by reading the meditation. I just want to thank her for this incredible job she has done assembling this anthology. I know we're all thankful, but I will say in particular, as a teacher of creative nonfiction, there have literally only been a handful, I'd say 3 books in my time that I've actually trusted enough and found enough depth in to use as an anchoring text for an entire workshop. And this is instantly going on the list as one of those books. And that just speaks to the thoughtfulness of the curation, the opportunities to get different depths of thinking about the craft with essays and with the meditations and the varieties. It's terrific. Before I find myself in an embarrassing situation, can I get a thumbs up from someone that you can hear me and that it's an okay connection? All right, good. I would hate to finish and look at you expectantly and be like, you're muted. But it is, let me give my brief dirty laundry behind the scenes introduction to this piece, the thing that I didn't want to put at the back of the book when I was asked about it. When I was, about 30, 31, I got the chance to publish a memoir. That was extraordinary and somewhat flukish, but I wrote a book called Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, Tales from an Allergic Life. And I mention this not to show a book cover, although I do love the cupcake top of a skull, but to say that when you publish a memoir that young, your life keeps changing. And I found myself really struggling with the ways in which my life changed profoundly after I had already committed a version of my life to the page. So one of the things I want to acknowledge is that this flash segmented piece that's included here was really part of a larger project that I was working on called Dismantling, Essays After Memoir. And it was really kind of interrogating with a mix of craft and creative pieces what it even means to try to shape your life on the page and then have that life keep changing. And I found myself, you would think that having written 4 books of poetry, that if I got the chance to write a memoir, I would do super lyric, that it would be very poetic. That wasn't the case at all. I felt I almost had this perverse sense that I had to prove I could do real narrative nonfiction. So I did interviews and I did research and I had these long sustained chapters, and I love that version of the book. But as I was doing this dismantling and writing these essays, I found myself craving very unconventional forms, fragmented, changes in point of view, experimental. So I guess I think I'll leave it at that, just to say that among several things that I was interested in, it was the distance between fact and truth, the idea that two people or two groups of people could have the very same set of facts and extrapolate a very different set of truths from it. I mean, among some of the other things that happened after publishing a memoir, I had fallout in close relationships. I had severe shifts in my sense of self. It was kind of a wild ride. So I would only ask with this piece, you'll hear two distinct sections. I would ask that you hear them as two commentaries on the same set of facts, finding two different sets of truths in that facts. There's also essentially a shift in speakers. Depends on who you ask. I promised myself to be on I-35 South by noon, but my head kept nodding toward the steering wheel. The car rumbled along a strip marking the edge of a lane. I pulled into the parking lot of a small town market. I tried to make it a practical stop, a chance to stock the fridge that awaited me, before realizing I had another 6 unrefrigerated hours to Wichita. Still, I'd been wandering the Sunfresh for so long that I had to buy something. A Kansas City souvenir, I said to the cashier. By the time I got to the car, a cup of coffee had sluiced through my system. I doubled back to the restrooms in the hardware half attached to the market. The other cashier asked, "How can I help you?" Embarrassed to admit why I'd walked back in, I reached for what cash I had in pocket. Not enough, even for a can of de-icer. That's when I remembered fussing at my husband before leaving DC for failing to keep our matte knife sharp. Perfect excuse. She walked into our market and paced the aisles for an hour. She filled a basket with groceries, then returned them all to the shelves. Instead, she bought a bottle of gin, came back for a pack of razor blades, and drove away. We never saw her again. This is my meditation on the piece. Memoirists come to their work with a tremendous sense of vulnerability, but to outside readers, particularly to family and friends, our position is one of power. How can the author complicate the implicit authority of their narration? How can we question in real time our own reliability? This flash piece juxtaposes a firsthand experience with speculating another person's take on the same set of actions. Both versions are factually accurate. Although it'd be easy to claim the first version is the real story, perhaps the latter version captures something the former won't admit. I'm interested in what it looks like formally to surrender power on the page. And for all its tall grass, prairie beauty, Kansas can get lonely in winter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I'll never forget the first time that I read that, and I took a long beat before I realized how the two parts fit together, and then I just loved what my brain did. So I encourage you all to seek these out on the page, ideally through the book, but it's a really different experience to hear these out loud and than to read them on the page. And I have to say, for me, it's so wonderful to hear them in your own voices, as in person as we can get, having spent a lot of time reading and rereading them on the page. So for me, this is pretty magical to hear you read your own work and to talk about it as well, hearing even a little bit more of the behind the scenes process. I very much appreciate it. So thank you, Sandra. Before I introduce our last reader, I just want to encourage you to use the chat. If you want to ask any questions, you can ask them whenever you want to, and then we can kind of loop back to that after the readings and have a general conversation all together. So our next reader is Latonya McQueen, the author of the novel When the Reckoning Comes, and it begins like this. That's the whole title. And it begins like this, from Black Lawrence Press. She has an MFA from Emerson College, a PhD from the University of Missouri, and is an assistant professor of English and creative writing at Coe College. Thank you, Latonya.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read this piece. I specifically wrote it for this anthology, and it's sort of interesting to kind of think about it now, because I've now sort of am dealing with the fallback from what this essay is about. And the essay is about, like, at the time I wanted to write about how, or the situation, like, what do you do when you have feelings for somebody and you are sort of in this like middle space where you're not sure if you should say something, and if you do say, like, you're aware if you do say something and it doesn't work out, then you know what then you're in this sort of weird situation, right? And so for me, I was interested in like writing an essay that sort of looks at the situation and like kind of over the course of the essay working up to this idea of confessing. It's called Of a Confession Sketched from 10 Vignettes. 1. It begins with a feeling unrecognized, an unasked question, and the fear of both calling into being. 2. This is a story between a woman and a man, but first we must deal with the question of names. If this was fiction, we could use a pseudonym for the other, maybe an anagram of their name, but this is not fiction. The endeavor, this one is true. Yes, the act of unnaming enables a desire for clarification, but specificity proves fraught. What could be said that would not lead a reader through a process and error of discovery? What could be said that would not make one go searching in an attempt at winnowing down to an answer? If you knew, what would it matter? Instead, we will strip this down to the abstract, including only the necessary particulars. This is a story between two people where one has fallen for the other, and a story that deals with the aftermath of this realization. This is a story that could encompass many of us, a story that could also perhaps describe you. 3. The conflict encapsulated into 4 sentences. 1, a woman once loved someone who didn't love her back. 2, a woman loved someone who didn't love her. 3, a woman loved someone. 4, a woman loves. 4. If this is about a woman's attempt at confessing her feelings for another, where A, the inciting incident leads to B, rising action resulting in C, climactic moment, then A is the recognition of the feeling leading to B, the grappling with what she should do, if she should tell him, and what the risk is in saying, leading up to her attempts over and over to get at the heart of the thing, while each time failing to say until, and C, question mark. 5. 3 previous attempts at confessing. Attempt number 1. I care about you, she tries to say, but care doesn't quite get to the root of it. A person can care for friends, parents, they can care about a neighbor. Yet to her, there is something more revealing in the word. She cares about his happiness. She wants him to be happy, with or without her. Attempt number 2. I feel close to you, she thinks, but this too is not quite right. But for her, she is not one for closeness. She lives a life of comfortable detachment because that is how one stays safe, unhurt, but she feels close to him. Somehow he has broken that barrier and she is not the same. Attempt number 3. I miss you, she says after a brief time apart, but what she means to say is she misses him in the after he recognizes her yearning and inevitably pulls away. Already, she misses the time before she ever told him, back when she could dwell in the possibility of what has not happened but could. 6. I think you need to pick a boat and get in it, a friend suggests. Tell him no more hedging, say it bluntly, say it plain. But there is risk in doing that, though. Yeah, there's always a risk. There's always something at stake in the confessing of a desire. I don't know if I can do it. Well, what is to be gained in telling? What do you even want? Because if you're not able to answer that for yourself, it might be best to just say nothing at all. 7. Perhaps it could be like it was when we were children, a ripped notebook sheet, a pencil, scrawled markings over the blue-lined paper, a question formed, simple, direct, followed with a checkbox next to a choice of answers. If only it could be that simple to write, I like you, do you like me too? Please check 1, check yes, or check no, or check maybe. 8. We have not worked ourselves toward an answer, but she has considered the potential possibilities. She tells him and he does not feel the same. She tells him he does not feel the same, and she realizes afterward that actually she mischaracterized her feelings and does not feel what she originally thought. She tells him, he says he does not know how he feels, and the two of them are left in a dreary limbo until one of them or both decides to pretend the situation never happens. If they are friends and she tells him and he does not feel the same, she has to now live with a friendship that is not the same as it once was. 9. She has not envisioned a possibility where he does feel the same. It feels impossible he ever could, and therein lies the crux. She knows the path this will take, but hopes for a different potentiality anyway. This is what is to be gained, she thinks, because so many of us would do anything for just the hope of a desire. And while she does not know how long she can temper her heart, she understands that confessing will lead to the inevitability of moving on rather than having to remain in the lingering unrequitedness that has surrounded her life. But what if he could? And what if knowing was as simple as asking the question? And what if this essay merely was that question in disguise? What if this was my attempt of asking if it could be possible, if you could? If I was to ask it now, if I were to end like this, with saying it bluntly, with saying it plain, do you think, could you maybe? What then would you say? Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. What a treat to hear these out loud, all of your different inflections, the way all of you represent the piece on the page with pauses. And it's such a delight to hear these out loud. These 3 readings so powerful in their different ways. Thank you so much. If anyone in the audience has questions, you can put them in the chat. Maybe Zach can sort of help if there's a scrum, but please feel free to ask some questions so that we can broaden this conversation out to all of us.
Especially since I know we have a lot of fellow writers in the audience. I see you, I know your work. I'm sure there's some interesting questions sparked by what we've talked about.
Whenever when we did in-person readings, I would always have questions, and then I never wanted to, like, I always feel super awkward in person. But in some ways I like Zoom, right? Because you can just sort of type it and then no one sees you. So it feels
Yes. The chat
something.
is a huge boon to introverts who, yes, often want to ask or say, but not feel like they're necessarily interrupting. So I see a question in the chat that says, I realize the difficulty of coming up with a name for this very interesting. Could any of you describe what you see as the difference between a lyric essay and a lyric prose poem? That's such a great question. And if one of you wants to jump in with an answer before I fumble around, please do. Sandra, I'm looking at you.
I feel like my answer wouldn't be very good because I would just say it's whatever the writer wants to call the thing that they're doing. So probably I'm not the best in terms of answer there. So if anybody else has a more articulate one, they should go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I have one that's kind of, I guess it's a little juicy because I see there's some co-editors in the space who are they both Jonah Colson and Caroline Bach. This is relevant, I swear. They did this great anthology called This Is What America Looks Like. And I got really put on the spot with this question because I ended up publishing a piece in here that is considered a prose poem, but I've really debated whether it's a prose poem or a flash nonfiction. Or a lyric essay that operates in flash. So as somebody who moves material back and forth frequently between the two genres, and actually I do think at one point there was a version of Depends on Who You Ask that maybe started as a poem somewhere. Here's the thing for me. Poetry at the end of the day has no stipulative truth value. And I am a very aggressive reviser and self-editor. I move anything I write through radically different forms: lineation, concision, sound play, image, you name it, rotated point of view, rotated tense, all of that stuff. What I find is that if the piece that I've written, if I start resisting edits that I know on some level make the text stronger for the reader experience, but deviate from the inspiring action or experience that made me want to write it, then I know it's a flash nonfiction, that with a lyric nonfiction. If I find myself ultimately comfortable making changes for the aesthetics, which might mean inventing something, conflating something, moving something around, then I approach it as a prose poem.
I think it might, well, I feel like anyone can diagnose these pieces of writing once they're out in the world, however they want to. I was approached after reading, complimenting the poem I just read, and I'm not at all a poet. It was 100% a lyric essay. All the lines went all the way to the ends of the margins, but the way it sounded to the ear was poetic. So I took it as quite a compliment. I think it might matter in terms of what the writer thinks when they are creating the piece, because it influences choices, as Sandra was saying, frankly, much more eloquently than I'm about to. But I feel that that's also true with something like a segmented essay, which is also known as a fragmented essay or a collage essay or a mosaic essay. But if you're going into something thinking, I'm writing a fragmented essay that has a different kind of energy to it, it might be sharper, it might be deliberately trying to break something apart. If you go into something thinking that I'm writing a mosaic essay, then you might feel like you're bringing things together more deliberately. It's a coming together kind of energy. That's great in the drafting process. When it's out in the world, someone might call it something completely different. I know I've called Sarah Einstein's pieces in the anthology a segmented essay. She often calls it a collage essay when she's reading. I will say that I was careful to ask the readers to identify what kind of essay they were submitting, because I wanted to make sure that I honored their intentions for whatever it is they were writing. And I think one of the pieces in here, the flash I'm calling it the flash lyric essay Nevermore by Katie Manning, has actually been published elsewhere as a prose poem. So I think the lines are blurry. I think it kind of depends on how much you care about defining a piece of work. And I kind of go back and forth as I write about a little in the introduction. Part of me loves a good taxonomy. Like I really want to put a name to thing. I want to hold on to it. I want to classify it. But lyric essays are really slippery that way. They resist. And I really appreciate that resisting. So I don't know if any of us have too much of a hard and fast differentiation, except that nonfiction should be nonfiction. It should be as true as the writer knows it to be. And a prose poem doesn't have to, it can be, but it doesn't have to be held to that standard. Thanks. Okay, things are happening in the chat. So let me take a look. Oh, thank you, Caroline, for posting that. Okay, what kind of essay is a hermit crab essay? That is a great question. And we didn't read any tonight, but a hermit crab essay is an essay that borrows an extra literary form of writing to take as its structure. So it has to be a written structure, but it's not literary. It's not a poem or short story, but it's usually something much more utilitarian, like a recipe or a syllabus or a medical advice site or an instruction manual or a Yelp review. And then you use that as a structure for whatever content you want to introduce. And usually there's a happy tension between the form and content. I have an essay in the anthology. It's a hermit crab essay called The Heart is a Torn Muscle. And in brief, it's about a transgressive crush that I had, a crush I had that I should not have been having, but I had it. And I wound up writing about it in the form of a medical advice site like WebMD, because in real life, not my writer life, I pulled a muscle in my back while I was working on this essay. I looked up how to cure a torn muscle, and all the things that I was reading about to try to fix my actual back felt relevant to try to fix my metaphorical heart, how to cure this torn muscle. And so that's just one example, but there are others in the book that involve a word search puzzle, dictionary definitions, and I've spent so much time with this, but now I'm kind of blanking out. There's an abecedarian, which follows the alphabet. Each section starts with A, then B, then C, then D, and goes all the way through, even with X and difficult X and Z. There's one that's told in the form of a label on a bottle of body wash, which I think is really tremendous. It talks about, the essay is about teenage homelessness, but you will recognize instructions that you would find on a bottle of body wash. So it's a really fun and an experimental form to write in, or even just to play with in a draft, just to see how that can push your thinking. Okay. I'm skimming through the chat to see if there are other questions. This is one that I think is great, and I'm not going to be the first to answer this one. Do you find certain subjects lend themselves to this form, or does the form choose you? And I'm not sure if that is about hermit crab essays or any, but I think it's a good question to ask about any of these forms that we heard: segmented, flash, braided.
I can't tell if we're all thinking or if we're all trying to be polite.
I don't want to talk too much. I want to hear from you too. I think I'm coming off of a slew of teaching these topics. So part of me is like, oh, I have a thought. And I'm like, nope, gonna hold back.
And I'm holding back because my kids are yelling in the other room. So I'm trying to mute them as much as possible. But I think for me, it's not necessarily that the subject informs the form that I use. I think it's just kind of a gut feeling. And there are lots of things that I've tried in one form that just didn't feel like they were working. And when I converted it to another, be it poetry, to creative nonfiction or vice versa. Sometimes it just works better in one or the other for reasons I'm not entirely sure how to define. But like my essay actually started as a poem and it just wasn't working as a poem. And I felt like I needed to break out of thinking about it as a poem to really let myself deal with these ideas in a more, I don't know, thorough way or just in a more expansive way on the page. And it ended up just working a lot better as a braided essay. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I'm not sure what my answer, like I get this question a lot because I write fiction too, right? And so sometimes people will ask me like, how do I decide between fiction or nonfiction? It's like, I don't know. I mean, it's like, I don't know, sometimes like I think it's one thing and then I try it and it just is not working. And so I try another form, right? I try another genre or form. Other times it's like I want to attempt a particular form, right? And then it's more sort of figuring out what idea is gonna work for it, right? So I don't know, like it's both, I guess, in terms of like form or versus idea. And then also too, there's a lot of, I think, crossover for me at least, and there's a lot of like my real life and truth in my fiction. And then I'm also too interested in like the idea of speculative nonfiction, right? Like, so using different techniques to try to kind of veer into the speculative territory. So I'm really interested in like the ways in which these forms can blur. And then also too, people sometimes say my stuff too is also too veering into poetry. And I'm like, Lord, I don't know. Whatever you want to call it, I guess. But yeah, I, in terms of like one or the other, how I decide, it's just whatever I can get to work is where I go.
I think for me, the gravitation towards experimental forms often comes as a result of problem solving, kind of getting engaged with a topic, but also recognizing the difficulties. I mean, and I'll give just to keep it grounded, just like 3 super quick examples. Abecedarian forms have a natural sense of resolution. Like, you know, when you get to Z, you're done. And so like they are really great for if you're thinking about wanting to write through a topic that has no logical conclusion, none in narrative time, none possibly even in emotional time, but you can kind of refocus on the organization and the cresting of energy within the alphabet, within this there aren't that many forms that have a defined endpoint the way that one does. Braids, you know, Brenda Miller uses the analogy of challah bread, which I've never gotten to eat, but sometimes I'll ask people if they get a chance to eat brownies or cake, do you go for the edges and the corners? And for a lot of people, the answer is yes. And I say that braided essays work for topics where what you're most interested in are the edges, the places of juxtaposition. So the meeting spots. And so in a weird way, like the same way that a poetry manuscript with multiple sections offers chances for section closers, section openers, that's what a braided essay does for the material. It gives you lots of strands, edges to work with. I had something that I was trying to write about. This was part of a dismantling essays after memoir project that was about the grueling, just the merciless experience of being auditioned for a magazine where I thought I was trying out for a feature on myself as a writer. It turned out it was a fashion shoot, and it really I didn't fit into the dress they had picked out for that day, so they didn't choose me. And I internalized that in a really kind of hideous way for a while. But every time I tried to write about it, it so quickly veered into self-pity. So I ended up using a hermit crab. I used the rigor of a questionnaire, of a quiz, actually like a magazine quiz of the type that you might find in an issue of Glamour or Cosmo, to kind of cut away the places where I wanted to elaborate and self-pity and blame, to just kind of reduce it, to use the rigor of the shell to reduce it to its constituent elements.
I think hermit crab essays are especially great for that, for what I call messy content. And it can be emotionally messy content or intellectually messy content, but the form is already there. So there's a rigid container to hold that messiness and help shape that messiness however you choose. I think for a lot of us, the choices are really instinctive and therefore difficult to figure out why. But I do think you can challenge yourself if you're writing prose and it seems kind of diffuse or really prosaic. What if you did break it up into segments? What if you just said, I'm not going to write any connective tissue. I'm just going to hit this scene, this scene, this scene, and this scene and see what they look like together. Maybe you're done. Maybe the segments talk to each other in a way that you don't have to explain all the transitions between them. For braids, that idea of juxtaposition that Sandra was talking about, definitely. What if you have two things that you can't stop thinking about, or three things, and you don't entirely know how they relate? But if you keep putting them against each other in different combinations, a braided essay can emerge where each of those strands takes its turn in the center at the reader's attention, the way the strands of a braid, each one crosses over to take its turn in the center. And I think for flash pieces too, I love the challenge of thinking, what if I had to write this entire book project in just 500 words? Like, wow, not a pitch, not an elevator speech, but like the whole thing, the mood of it, the tone. And that could be a really useful challenge. Or if you want to get really deep into one sort of small moment, then and dilate that moment, that might be a good occasion for a flash. So even though it's usually instinctive, for me at least, there are times when you can sort of deliberately choose a form to provoke your own work, to push your own thinking, to make something happen, even if it's never published, even if that draft never makes it. Oh, I just saw the most recent chat, which says, I'd love to hear Randon's answer to that question. So I better read the one that came before. I was so grateful to find an anthology that included author reflections on the pieces. How or when did that idea come up in creating the anthology? And did the authors find the process difficult? Did the insight itself begin to slip into lyrical form because you were thinking deeply about the piece and process? The post-essay writings are so lovely. I cannot help but wonder. They are lovely. I was blown away by these meditations. So what I did is there are 50 contributors in the anthology, and I had a deliberately light touch in the introduction because I didn't want my thinking about the lyric essay to completely dominate. I wanted there to be room for people who have different ideas about the lyric essay, because there are many. So I invited each of the contributors to contribute, to write a short meditation, and it could be on their particular essay. It could be about the lyric essay in general. I asked like maybe 5 open-ended questions to give the contributors just a little bit of direction. And I got the idea from the anthology Sudden Fiction, which is a flash fiction anthology that came out, I want to say, in the 80s. Is it possible that it was that long ago? Someone is nodding. Thank you. And at the time, it was kind of a newly named form, let's say, really short fiction. And so what do we call it? What is this thing? And for that anthology, all the contributors wrote something about what they decided to call it sudden fiction, what this really short form meant. And I thought that was really neat when I read it at the time. And then when I was trying to figure out how to get more thinking about the lyric essay into this anthology, how can it be more of a conversation and not just an authoritative introduction and then everyone else kind of falls into line? How could I do that? So I thought, why don't I ask? So I asked all the contributors to write something, and the ranges of response are amazing. Some of them are very deep. Some of them are rather cheeky. All of them, though, were gorgeously written, because it's not all the time that you can have like a beautiful writer, like the writing is beautiful and then the thinking behind it is equally beautiful. But for the 49 other people in this book, that proved to be the case. So I'll turn this now to the contributors who are here. Did you find the process difficult, and did the insight itself begin to slip into lyrical form because you were thinking deeply about your piece or about the process of writing lyric essays?
Oh, yeah, please, Latonya, please. Yeah.
No. No, I have no answer. So no.
No, I just want to say, I feel the only two other times I've gotten to do those commentaries, once was for, they were both poetry. Once was for a Persia anthology called The Eloquent Poem, and once was for a long ago issue of Best American Poetry. And I just thought it was so awesome. I was so delighted to get the chance. And here's what I'll say about mine, and maybe this to some extent does slip into the creative mode. I knew I needed to say something about Kansas. I knew I needed to say something about the melancholy of Kansas. And that was technically impossible in my creative nonfiction piece because it was based on a time when I had not yet gotten to Kansas. I was still on the Missouri side. I'd never been to the state. So I could not figure out a way in a creative nonfiction piece really to say what to comment on the loneliness of the scenario that I was going into. So I was really grateful because I felt like in some ways the meditation could complete the experience in the way that often my very brief introduction to a poem in a reading helps complete the experience of the poem.
Kristen or Latonya, do either of you want to take a shot at this one?
I don't know. I don't know if I can answer it. Think about it a little bit more.
That's fine.
It's such a I don't know. I guess I don't know if it bled into, right? Because to me there's sort of separate forms, so that's why it's hard for me to answer it, I think, in any sort of appropriate way.
Yeah, I think for me, like, it didn't bleed over. I don't think mine became lyrical as a meditation, but I really appreciated being asked to write this because I had honestly never thought about it before, only because I began as a poet and I'd written so many poems. And one day I started writing essays, and I hadn't really thought about the reason for that shift or the reason I choose one or the other. So it was really nice to reflect on my own process and identify those things for myself, things that I really had not considered, and I think have informed pieces moving forward about, why I choose a lyric essay as opposed to a poem.
I'm so glad they were interesting. They were incredibly interesting to read. Part of my motivation for this is I've had my work introduced in ways that really surprised me. Like, I thought, really, that's what you think is going on here? Wow. And I had to write an introduction, but I didn't want that to happen. So again, I wanted to have this be a little bit more of a conversation. And for readers of this anthology, whether writers or students or readers or just someone who likes the cover and picks it up in a bookstore, I wanted them to really see the range of thinking about the lyric essay, and that there's sort of a broad general consensus about what this form is and what it can do, but there are so many different facets to it. And I wanted as many of those facets to be revealed in this anthology as possible, both through the work, through the essays that I accepted, through the craft essays, which I love saying are lyric essays about lyric essays, but also through the meditation, so that everyone got to make a few remarks about the craft of this exciting form. Okay, we are just about at 8 o'clock. That might be the perfect place to end, unless there's one more burning question that's typed rapidly into the chat. But if not, I will say thank you again all for coming. Thank you so much, readers, for sending these essays in, for writing one specifically for this anthology. I was overwhelmed with the wonderful work that I got, and it was such a pleasure to put this work together. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to the Writer Center for hosting us this evening. So thank you all so much.